Yeah, well, the thing is that the gender aspects of the societies in ancient Mesopotamia really haven't been studied all that much yet. Actually, the whole idea of studying women's history really only began in the 1960s. Basically, a lot of scholars noticed that actually his story is also her story, and that women had been left out quite a lot in the previous history writing. Then there were several different approaches to how to study women in the ancient Near East. And of course, the first approach was just writing women into history, figuring out like, okay, so what were they doing, how did they work, how did they live their lives in the ancient world. The second part of research came after that, when a lot of scholars became interested in forms of power and oppression between genders. And at that time, 70s, 80s, 90s, it became very important to distinguish between two aspects, between sex and gender. Sex referring to biological sex, and gender referring to social roles of the individuals.
So gender studies as a theory-driven approach within Egyptology, at least as a sideline, as a marginal line, is in existence since the 1980s. The question of women in power is much, much older, because we have a lot of really important women figures in the highest political power. We have the issue of Hatshepsut, one of the major queens, where there are different depictions of her as a female or as a male pharaoh, because the gender role is male of pharaoh, and one has found solutions to depict her as male and as female. And so there was actually an indication that the issue of gender as a question of biological sex or the role one was aware of that already in ancient times. One key issue I think we have to take into account is that the evidence we have, the ancient sources we just simply have, strongly favors a focus on the male part of society. Most of the pharaohs are male. Most of the stelae we have are of male courtiers. But there are stelae, there is evidence for independent display of women in the main role. So it's something we can address, we should address, and which to some extent also is addressed.
When I started to analyze power use in the Assyrian palaces, from that perspective, I began to see more or like different kinds of forms of power, and a lot of them had to do with women of the palace. But then when you look at the kind of negotiations that happen, and when you look at the kind of interactions that people have with each other, then you start to see that the elite women were actually acting in a lot of the same ways that elite men. Yeah, so in my work, I was really interested in individuals' power. Like, what are we talking about when we are talking about the power of an individual? And that's when I, at the end of my research, I decided to use this framework of hierarchical power on the one hand and hierarchical power on the other hand. So obviously hierarchical power is, power that moves from up to down or from top to bottom. So somebody is telling you to do something and you do that. But hierarchical power is also all the other forms of power that exist in human relationships. So lateral power, and also power that's coming from below to upwards levels. And that's a kind of power that manifests itself, for example, in negotiations, in making consensus decisions, in all kinds of informal, unspoken networks of power.
Well, in my view, both sex and gender, and also the tension between biological sex and gender more as a role, fit in Egyptology and also into the ancient Egyptian narratives. So we have indications where actually this differentiation is of importance, is addressed in ancient times, even though in most cases we cannot see it from our evidence and have to study it and impose upon it in a way from our modern perspective.
But what I really want to do next is try and grasp what's happening to gender roles, what's happening to gender in what follows in the Persian empires, and perhaps even beyond that. And this kind of research requires a lot of cooperation. It requires a lot of people with different kind of expertise. And we are, of course, at the moment very lucky in Helsinki to have a center of excellence in ancient Near Eastern empires. So I see this kind of gender research as part of Centre's mission.